In the last video, we talked about mistakes that ruin most MLB DFS seasons, trying to be right instead of trying to be profitable. A lot of you came back and said, okay, I see what you're saying, but what does that actually mean when I sit down to build lineups? Well, that's exactly what we're going to go over today. We're going to sit down and go through my 5-step process I use on every single slate to build lineups. And we're going to open up some of the tools on my website, and we're going to see how these skills play out in real time. So remember, we're not trying to build a lineup that scores some outrageous amount of points on DraftKings. We're trying to score more points than the next guy. Yeah, that's going to mean some highly projected players, but that's not what our focus is. Our focus is how do we beat the other people in our contest. So step one, and it's the one that most nobody says, is don't start with the players. You need to start with the slate. There's so many different aspects of a slate that will ultimately change your decisions on how you build your lineups. So before I look at a single hitter, I want to understand the landscape. Which games have the highest totals? Where's the field going to concentrate? Are there any weather impacts? Because that's what tells me where any duplication risk or high leverage and high chalk plays are going to come in before I even start building. So whatever that looks like for you, try to get a good idea of what we're working with this slate. Is someone in Coors? Is the wind blowing out in Wrigley? Or do we have multiple aces on this slate? Do we have some spots in really cold weather or wind in that we need to bump up the pitchers? Those are the things you need to be thinking about, and you need to research before you even get building, because all of these things will ultimately impact how you construct your lineups. And two, is it going to be a chalk heavy slate? Are there only 2 good pitchers that everyone's going to play over 50% of the time? Well, if that's the case, then we need to understand that going in. And if we're going to go with those 2 pitchers, we need to understand that they're chalky and make sure we find hitters that will give us a good leverage spot. But in our research, if we see that there's a couple other pitching options that we may be able to target, well, then maybe it's okay to target some of those higher projected team totals, since we're getting a little different at pitcher. So those are all these things that need to go through your mind as you're approaching a slate. So most players open up a lineup builder and just start clicking names. So I open up a slate and start asking questions. Step 2, it's going to be find the chalk. Every slate has obvious plays, high projections, good matchup, everyone sees them. Is it a slate with only 2 top pitchers? Well, if that's the case, then we're probably going to need to make a decision on if we're going to go with both of those pitchers. And if so, we need to find an under the radar team that'll give us a chance to really differentiate ourselves against the field. But if we find a few spots where maybe we can get off one of the 2 main pitchers, then we have an opportunity to go to some of the higher total bats on the slate. So one of the main mistakes I see in identifying chalk is just playing it automatically without asking what happens to your position if everyone else has it. So chalk isn't the enemy. Playing chalk without knowing you're playing chalk is the enemy. Were you expecting a pitcher to come in at 10% owned? You open up the slate and now he's 35%? That changes everything. That is where you can look back and say, I built incorrectly based on how the slate turned out, and put in practice maybe some steps to identify that in the future. But if you go into a slate playing a pitcher expecting him to be 10% and he comes in at 10%, regardless of the outcome, your mindset was in the right place when building that lineup. In step 3, this is where the game actually changes. Find your leverage spots. And I want to be really clear what leverage means, because I hear people misuse it all the time. Leverage doesn't mean playing weird. It doesn't mean fading chalk just to be different. Leverage means finding the specific spot where the field may be over-concentrated and making a deliberate decision to go a different direction in the right spot. Let's say Tariq Skubal's playing the White Sox. Well, if he's 80% owned and you think he should be 60% owned, well, then fading him would be a positively leveraged decision. And if he's so over-owned that you actually decide to play the White Sox, whether that's 2, 3, or 5 White Sox, I don't mind that. But what if Tariq Skubal's 40% owned and he should be 60? There's no reason to be playing the White Sox here. That is that unnecessary risk that the dart throw that you're just taking for absolutely no reason. And remember, sometimes there's really not much different between this kind of first tier and second tier. If you're watching shows or doing your research or looking at team totals, it might just seem so sure that, yeah, the Dodgers are projected 5.2 runs and the Braves are projected 4.9, so I got to play the Dodgers. When in reality, there's really not that much of a difference between those two numbers. So you should factor that in to how the field is responding and how owned some of those stacks or spots may be on a specific slate. So you don't need to be different everywhere. You just need to be different in one or two spots, because that's what separates your lineup from thousands of others when it hits. All right, so step 4 is going to be correlation. This is what separates lineups that can actually win a GPP from lineups that just score well. So we've gone into this a little bit when we've talked about cash versus GPP. The cash lineups are going to be, your 8 best hitters that project well with really no correlation between them. If you're searching for a high percentile outcome in a single game, you're going to want correlation. Just think about it. If you're building the Mets and you have Francisco Lindor, Juan Soto, and then you mix in Luis Robert. Well, if Robert hits a 3-run home run and Soto and Lindor are on base, well, now your lineup just catapults up the field. So one big inning in a correlated stack doesn't just help one player. It can help the entire stack, 4 or 5 players. And not only are they knocking each other in, they're actually getting back up to bat quicker. They're getting to the bullpen quicker. And if your team actually runs away with it in real life, they may even get a position player in the 8th or 9th inning, which is just massive upside. So when you're doing your research, look for these spots where you can take multiple hitters from the same team. Even if maybe one piece, let's say that Ronald Acuna is going really high on a spot, but the rest of the Braves aren't. Well, is building the rest of the Braves with Acuna going to make you different? If so, it might be a great spot to stack the Braves. All right, so a lineup full of good players in 4 different games can score, a respectable amount of points, and you'll cash probably more than me. But a correlated lineup that gives that winning score and you ultimately take down a contest, that's the difference. All right, so step 5, before you lock in anything, check the lineup as a whole. Not, do I like these players, but how does this lineup compare to what the field is building? If my stack hits, how many other lineups benefit? If the answer is thousands, you probably should rethink at least one spot. That's the mindset you should be having when you build these teams. Are you going with 2 chalky pitchers? Well, then find you a stack that's a little off the radar. Obviously, you want to get one that projects well. If there's a reason in your research that you think a team's maybe getting overlooked, well, then go with them and mix in 2 good pitchers. So when that team that you're on and no one else's hits, you're in position to have a huge outcome. You're kind of working through these outcomes and kind of testing your own lineup before even submitting. The goal is 1 or 2 spots of real separation without sacrificing too much ceiling with respect to the rest of the field. So most players submit a lineup and hope it scores high. Profitable players submit lineups that they know when they're right. It's not about how often we're right. It's how much do we get paid out when we're right. Now that's the framework, and I built my tools specifically around this process, so every piece of information I need to execute these steps is right in front of me. Let me show you exactly how I would use them on a specific slate. All right, so this is my MLB stats reference page over on PresidentLeach.com. This is actually free to use, so feel free to check it out if you're interested. What you're seeing on the screen now is the April 1st games. So what I do when I first open the slate is try to get an idea of what to expect. So real quick, I have a pitchers tab here. You can go, you can filter on main. This is for the filters here are based on DraftKings, and you can get an idea of what we're looking at on this slate. Sorting by K percentage, you can see, just look at these names. We have some top arms on the slate: Mizrowski, Sale, Crochet, Skeens, Peralta, Christopher Sanchez, all great pitchers on this slate. So we know going in, it's going to be important to get our pitchers right on this slate. On top of that, you can go through and check the weather on each of these games. What I would do is give a quick look at any rain potential and make note of that. And then also to take a quick look at potentially the weather and where the wind is at. Anything notable, if it's, standard, yeah, it's a little warm here in Atlanta, but other than that, nothing too notable, 5 mile per hour crosswind. You can look here, 84 degrees in Baltimore. So Texas and Baltimore would be potential stacks that you could target if they are coming in lower owned. Little bit of wind out here in Cincinnati. We know Paul Skeens is in that game, so that's interesting to note. Washington and Philly, another warm game with wind blowing out. So maybe we're a little lower on Christopher Sanchez if he's coming in higher owned. Colorado and Toronto are in the Dome, and Miami. St. Louis, a little bit of rain chance here. So I know I need to check back on the weather forecast for this game. Based on the temperature, I'm leaning pitchers if it truly is 50 degrees and the rain holds off. Milwaukee Dome, Houston Dome, Chicago, 37 degrees, wind in. This is a great spot for pitchers. A lot of the times the field knows that. So we'll have to keep an eye on what Matthew Boyd's or Yusei Kikuchi's ownership comes in at on this slate. This process can really be as thorough as you want. At the very least, I would say you need to note those things. If you want, you can come in here and look at your pitcher K percentages, what the opposing K percentage is based on who's potential in the lineup for that day. If you want to look at something specific as you're building, you want to look back and see how Nathan Eovaldi's looking against this team. The current Baltimore lineup is showing an insane amount of strikeouts, especially with some of these guys down here at the bottom. So little things like that you need to be aware of before you even start building. And you've heard me say a few times, I already have a few ideas of where I think chalk is going to go. So before we dig into the numbers, we have kind of the mindset of where to expect ownership to kind of consolidate and how we get different around that. All right, so what I'm looking at now is my MLB Lineup Builder on my website. The biggest thing I have to show is the pendulums between stack versus pitcher and secondary stack. So we can sort here by stacks. You can see points, of course, Braves, Phillies, some of these top teams are going to be highly projected. You see a few, though, Pirates, Rangers, Red Sox, and Houston. Again, the Orioles here against Eovaldi, a good pitcher. So you kind of get an idea of who the highest projected stacks are on the slate, and also too where the ownership is going to be. If you look over here to the right at my leverage column, you can see where I have a few of these teams projected to be overowned. It doesn't mean you don't have to play them. It just means if you play them, you need to get different elsewhere. So if we're planning to build a Brave stack, we're going to need to get different at pitcher or get different in some other way. So on the flip side, if we sort by leverage, we see a couple of the top leverage stacks here: White Sox, Rockies, Marlins, A's. So what I like to do is try to find a good balance. Yeah, these teams are leveraged, but I mean, look at the Rockies here. Under 4% chance of being optimal against Gausman. Yeah, they're showing leverage, but you still want to keep in mind that we have to score points on this slate to win. So I like to find a good balance of optimal and positive leverage. What stands out to me here is Baltimore against Nathan Eovaldi. We already saw it's going to be warm in Baltimore. So what does that look like if we build a stack with Baltimore? So we can go over to the hitters tab here, and let's filter on Baltimore and just see what that looks like as we build a lineup. So here on the side panel, you can see we can start our Baltimore build. This is sorted by projected points. One of the things I like to do is I tend to put my catcher in my stack. Catcher is just it's kind of a low ceiling position. So I'd like to get the guy that's kind of involved in the 8-10 plus run game. So I'm going to put Samuel Basallo in right now. Let's just put in a couple of these top hitters and let's see kind of how we're looking salary wise. We'll put in Pete Alonso, Gunnar Henderson, and Taylor Ward. I'm going to ultimately do 5, but let's come back and see how cheap we need to go on this last spot. We have several options here, sub 3K players, but let's leave it open for right now. Just kind of figure out if we need to go maybe second base or outfield. So we already have our stack. You can see we have a positive primary stack here with Baltimore. Let's take a look at the pitchers and see what we're working with. One of the main things that I want to see is what is Matthew Boyd's ownership. If you remember right, that Chicago game was extremely pitcher friendly, cold, wind blowing in. So you can see here, he's actually showing as the second most optimal pitcher, even though he's 7.3K compared to some of these other top arms. I'm actually going to add Matthew Boyd here in this spot. As I'm looking at this board, there's a few decisions we need to make. Since we already have a highly leveraged stack, I think it's okay if we went with one of these higher owned pitchers. These are top pitchers. We're already a little bit off the board with our stack, so I think it's okay to add in one of these top pitchers. Based on salary, I'm looking at Christopher Sanchez and Kevin Gausman. Let's add Christopher Sanchez in this spot. So now let's go back and finish up our lineup. So we have about 3.8K left per each hitting spot. So let's go back to Baltimore real quick. I'm just going to start at the bottom. Leody Taveras, he actually projects better than Dylan Beavers, 2K versus 2.3. So I'm going to add Leody Taveras in. And let's see what other stacks we can get to. So we already have a highly leveraged primary stack. It wouldn't kill us to go with a leveraged secondary stack as well in this spot. There's a few options here. I'm seeing some green. Houston would be an option. I think they're facing Garrett Crochet. And since we are fading Garrett Crochet, that could be a massive spot to get different if we decide to go there. What would it look like if we added a couple spots here from Houston? So I think we're going to have salary left. Let's add Carlos Correa and Yordan Alvarez to this spot. So it still gives us 4,400 left. And you can see we actually added 2 positively leveraged stacks so far on this slate. So really, I'm happy to see, we're making up for a negatively leveraged pitcher with positively leveraged stacks. So let's look at second baseman and try to find kind of the best player available and what that may look like. So sorted by points, you can see we have Bryson Stott, Jorge Polanco, Xavier Edwards. So I think actually this would be a spot to go Bryson Stott. He's showing positive leverage here, and also too he has correlation to Christopher Sanchez. What if Bryson Stott goes out and has 4 RBI game and a home run? Christopher Sanchez is probably more than likely in line for the win. So I really like that spot here for Bryson Stott, and it looks like it rounds out our lineup perfectly. So what you can do, you can save that lineup, whatever you want it to be, and your lineups will get saved here, and you can compare lineups over time. So if you want to build out a few and kind of compare them side by side, and I wouldn't be too caught up on this total number here. What I'm really looking at is we had negatively leveraged pitchers, but look who we went with: Matthew Boyd, Christopher Sanchez. We had great reason to think that Matthew Boyd was in a great spot and Christopher Sanchez was in a great spot. And yeah, they were a little bit higher owned than we may have liked. So what did we do because of that? We got different in our hitter spots. We targeted a positively leveraged Baltimore stack, mixed in a probably next to 0 owned Houston stack against Crochet. That's scary, but these are good hitters. Carlos Correa and Yordan Alvarez in a positively leveraged spot, and mixed in a correlated flex spot, which isn't always necessary that it's correlated, but it was just nice that it worked out that way today. Now, the specific players will probably change by the time you watch this video, but you saw my thought process. You saw the questions I asked myself as I worked through the slate. And yeah, you'll be applying these concepts to a different slate in a different ownership, and there'll be different numbers behind the scenes, different projections, different ownership. But the process I just walked through never changes. The slate context, identifying the chalk, finding the leverage spots, building correlation within your lineup. Every slate, every season, this framework will work. And the tool that I showed just makes it faster and more consistent to help you build highly profitable lineups. So profitable players are building a lineup that's designed to beat the field. And when they're right, they're going to take home one of these top payouts in these contests. So these are completely different concepts than you may have been playing. And once you start playing this way, the tools stop being about finding picks and start being about executing the process to your advantage. If you want access to the tools I just walked through, everything I just showed is over at PresidentLeach.com. Right now I'm offering a 7-day free trial if you want to give it a shot. And if this helps, subscribe, because this is exactly the content that I want to be putting out every week of the MLB season to help you have the most profitable year yet.